Today, this is session 6 out of 8. And so today is Mark 14 and 15, which is the Passion narrative. Passio in Latin means suffering, and passio in Latin translates pathos in Greek, which means suffering. And so after this, all we have left is the resurrection, which we'll do next week. And as you know, the original Gospel of Mark is believed by scholars to end at Mark 16:8, which is very problematic because it says, well, they didn't say anything to anybody because they were afraid. Kind of a strange ending, isn't it? And then there were other endings added later. There was one ending that doesn't even have a chapter and verse. It's called the shorter ending of Mark. It's called the Conclusio Brevior. And then there is Mark 16, 9 through 20, which is the longer ending of Mark. And then there's an ending that is only in Codex Washingtonianus, which is in the Freer Gallery of Art at the Smithsonian, and it's quite different. So counting Mark 16:8 as an ending, there are 4 different endings of Mark. And of course, I think the other 3 endings of Mark witness to the fact that people felt that 16:8 was really not a good ending. And then as the other Gospels are being written, then the other Gospels all had resurrection appearances, which Mark 16:1 through 8 has the story of the empty tomb, but not a resurrection appearance, okay? So it's a little bit problematic. And because the evidence is so detailed and because the evidence can be read in such different ways, no single solution to the question of the ending of Mark satisfies everybody. See? Okay. Now, here we go. Let's take a look at Mark 14, 1 through 2. Let me read it for you. Mark 14, verses 1 and 2. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. So the Passion narrative, assuming the Passion narrative begins in Mark 14:1, begins with the planning of the death of Jesus, or the plotting of the death of Jesus, by the chief priests and scribes. They don't want his arrest, conviction, and execution to be at a public event because they are very well aware that Jesus is very popular among the people, especially visitors from Galilee. Then Jesus goes to Bethany, and this is a very strange passage. Who wants to read this? It's Mark 14, 3 through 9. Who would like to read that? Fred, how about you?
After being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of a very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. But there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me you will not have always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly, I say to you, whoever this gospel is preached to the whole world, that this woman has done, will also be told as a memorial to her.
Okay, this is a strange story, but it illustrates the difference in attitudes between the disciples and the women who anointed Jesus. And so Jesus says, okay, she has anointed me in advance of my burial. So this makes it clear that Jesus understands himself to be headed towards death. And of course, in 14:9 is that famous line Wherever the good news is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. And so Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza in 1983, I believe, came out with the first feminist book on the whole New Testament. And it was a feminist way of looking at the whole New Testament and Christian origins. I wrote a review article for it in the Anglican Theological Review, and she entitled her book, In Memory of Her, A Feminist Theological Reconstruction of Christian Origins. And so that became the first great feminist book on Jesus and the Gospels. In Memory of Her is an important line because it became the title of Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's book. She taught at Notre Dame, and then she taught at Episcopal Divinity School, and then she taught, and I think she's still on the faculty at Harvard Divinity School, and has been a president of the Society of Biblical Literature. And then what happens in 10 and 11 is you get Judas agreeing with the chief priest to betray Jesus, with the idea they will catch Jesus at some relatively private time and place, and he will be arrested by the Roman guards that are assigned to the chief priests. And then, so that happens. And so when Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, then they paid him the 30 pieces of silver. Then after that, you have the Passover. You have the preparation for the Passover. And the room where the Passover was to be celebrated was rather miraculously provided, just like the donkey or the colt for Jesus to ride into Jerusalem. And we're really not told why it was miraculously provided. It's there. That's part of the story. And what happens, of course, verse 17, when it was evening, he came with the 12, and when they had taken their places and were eating the Passover, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, the one who is eating with me." They began to be distressed and to say to him one after another, "Surely not I." And he said, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. So the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to him, to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Okay, so Jesus, of course, foretells his betrayal. And of course, the death of Jesus has been foretold many times. For example, in the first prediction of the Passion in 8:27 and following, and then in chapter 9 of Mark, and then in chapter 10 of Mark, Jesus' suffering and death and resurrection was foretold 3 times. And it's that way in Mark, and Matthew and Luke pick it up as well. And then there is the Last Supper. And exactly what is going on at the Last Supper has been the subject of much debate. The institution of the Eucharist, the Last Supper, the Holy Communion, took place within the context of a Passover meal. But unfortunately, I believe it has little, if anything, to do with a Passover meal, because the motif of the Passover meal is the liberation of the Hebrew people from Egypt via the Exodus. The Exodus is what is celebrated at the Passover. And the motif of the liberation of Hebrew people via the Exodus is completely absent from the Eucharist, as portrayed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. By the way, the institution of the Eucharist is not in John, but also the institution of the Eucharist is in Paul in 1 Corinthians 11. But there's nothing about the Jewish Passover in the Christian Eucharist, but it took place in Matthew and Luke and Mark. It took place at the end of a Passover meal. In John, the Last Supper was not a Passover meal, but was a chaburah, or fellowship meal. But there's nothing about the institution of the Eucharist in John. So there are as many questions as answers. There used to be a thing in the 70s where Christians would take a Passover Haggadah and they would actually do something like a Christian Passover and try to tell our parishioners that the Eucharist was the Christian Passover. And years ago, probably in the 80s or 90s, the Standing Liturgical Commission urged clergy not to do that because, let the Passover be the Passover and let the Eucharist be the Eucharist. And I certainly agree with that. Let the Passover be the Passover and let the Holy Eucharist be the Eucharist. Why should we take a rite from another religion and then make that rite into something that religion does not intend it to be? So I think there's a lot to be said for not trying to do a Christian Passover. And I'm sure that I disagree with a lot of my colleagues in the ministry and lay people too.
So are you saying that no present-day Christian church should celebrate the Passover?
Right. We should celebrate our liturgy, which has its roots in the Passover, and our Holy Scriptures, which has massive roots in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, 3/4 of the Bible is the Old Testament, see? So we should celebrate the roots that are there and not try to manufacture roots that are not there. So I think that we should be careful. Whatever we say about our own church or about some other Christian church, we should be very careful to not say anything that is even remotely misleading. And I think that's even more true of other religions. And if you don't think that's true, just look at the Middle East. So that's the kind of thing that we have to be careful about. And I think we need to be more careful about it now. And of course, I'm a product of the 70s. I went to seminary in 76 and finished in 79. And so I'm a product of the 70s. But because Judaism has such a rich and detailed and long history, we should celebrate that rich, detailed, long, and beloved history as it is, rather than try to make it into something that it really isn't. And we should encourage people of other religions to do the same for us. Okay, after the Last Supper, at the end of the Last Supper, by the way, it's got bread, it's got wine. In the Gospel of Luke, it's got the cup of wine and then bread and then another cup of wine, and no one has ever said why in Luke. Cup, bread, cup. But Matthew and Mark don't have it that way. And then after that, they go out. Verse 26, when they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up," note the prophecy of the resurrection, "after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." And we find that also in what the risen Jesus says, or the angel says. He goes before you to Galilee. And Peter says, "Even though all become deserters, I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said vehemently, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the rest said the same. But we know what happened, right? And then Jesus prays in Gethsemane, asking God to take this cup of suffering away from him. And the disciples were sleeping. He said, "Stay awake and pray," right? And he didn't do it. They didn't do it. He finds them sleeping. Some people think it has to do with the wine at the Last Supper. And he says to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not stay awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into this time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And then Jesus is arrested. Immediately, verse 43, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. It doesn't look like Roman soldiers here, but the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came and went up to him, at once he said, "Rabbi," which literally means "my great one," right? And kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day by day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you didn't arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted and fled. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. This has occasioned some interesting debate and comments. Nothing very conclusive. Some people think that this linen cloth has something to do with the linen cloth that Jesus was buried in. And some people think it was the writer of the Gospel of Mark. But nothing, it's, you know, a lot of people make a lot of assertions, but when you make an assertion and you ain't got no evidence, then that does not help you any. It muddies the water. And the New Testament has got plenty of muddy water as it is. Okay, and then Jesus goes before the Sanhedrin, and they have a questioning. It's not a trial really, but it's certainly a testimony. I mean, he is questioned under oath. And the high priest in verse 61 even asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" The Blessed One means God. And Jesus says, "I am. I am. Yes, I am the Messiah." And remember, Peter had said in 8:27 and following, "You are the Messiah, you are the Christ." And so here Jesus himself says, "I am," he is the Messiah. And then he says, "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power." The power is God. "And coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" All of them condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. And then Peter denies Jesus. And so in verses 66 through 72, Jesus is denied by Peter. Peter denies his connection with Jesus 3 times, and the cock crows again. And then Jesus, in chapter 15, Jesus is delivered to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. By the way, Syria, Palestine, Israel, as the Romans called it, Judea, was not considered a very prized job. And so different provinces were presided over by governors, and the more plum jobs were presided over by people who were of senatorial rank. But Pontius Pilate was not, Judea, as the Romans called it, Judea, was not considered a plum job, primarily because the inhabitants of Judea could very easily riot. And of course, if they rioted against anybody, they would riot against the Romans, the occupation forces. So Jesus is delivered to Pilate. You can see that verse 3 of chapter 15, the chief priests accuse him of many things. And Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. And then eventually, Pilate wants to not crucify Jesus. He doesn't want to put Jesus to death. And there would be some reasons why, because you wouldn't want to start a riot at Passover, see? And so there was a person named Barabbas in verse 7 of chapter 15 who was imprisoned with the rebels who had committed murder during an insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. The idea is, as a gesture of kindness to the Jewish crowd, he would allow one Jewish criminal to be released. And so then, verse 9, he says, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again, "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "Crucify him." 14, Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" And they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus within an inch of his life, he handed him over to be crucified. And the fact that Jesus died on the cross after 3 hours means his was a terrible, terrible flogging. So in any event, it was really terrible. This, by the way, in the Gospels, portrays Roman justice to be almost a mock trial. And it portrays that the whole initiative of Jesus' death, Jesus' execution, was the fact that he did things that the chief priests and the Jewish hierarchy did not like. And there is much criticism of that. And in the most reasonable book that has been written in recent years, this is the book Jesus of Nazareth by Joachim Gnilke, who taught in the Catholic Faculty of Theology in Munich. He comes out very strongly and suggests and asserts the reason that Jesus was put to death really was all of the ways of Roman law that Pilate was able to use to accuse him of doing things that were in violation of Roman law, and that Jesus was put to death by the Romans, not because the Jews said you need to put him to death, but put to death by the Romans because Jesus was thought to be kind of a bandit or an insurrectionist. By the way, in sociology, a bandit is a pre-revolutionary. So there is considerable debate among New Testament scholars as to what were the legal reasons for Jesus to be put to death according to Roman law. And so in this book by Gnilke, who wrote a 2-volume commentary on Mark, he actually in chapter 11, he has the phrase causa mortis, the reason for his death. And he gives all of the reasons within Roman law why it was appropriate for Jesus to be executed. And of course, Pontius Pilate could only find him guilty under Roman law. Pontius Pilate would not be interested in finding anybody guilty under the Torah. So anyway, I haven't really seen a scholarly rejoinder to what Gnilke has argued about Roman law being the reason for Jesus' execution, and I would like to see more of that debate, and I'm sure that there is more of that debate to be seen. Probably after Christmas, I'm going to take a couple of weeks off and go over to Waco or Dallas or Chicago or somewhere and bury myself in a library and start reading articles, which is something that I've got all the books, but I don't have easy access to all the articles. So in late January, early February, depending on our annual meeting, I'll need to be away a couple of weeks to resume reading articles on Mark. And then, of course, Jesus is condemned to death. Jesus is mocked by the soldiers. On the road to Golgotha, Jesus was flogged terribly bad. Most likely, the persons being executed carried the horizontal cross beam rather than the upright beam. And so they carried it, and it was very heavy. And the tradition is that Jesus fell because it was just too heavy for him. And so they compelled a visitor to Jerusalem, Simon of Cyrene, and he carried the horizontal beam of the cross. The vertical was probably already there at the place of crucifixion. The Gospel of John does not mention Simon of Cyrene, and thus implies that Jesus carried his own horizontal beam. So to try to figure out what happened at the end of Jesus' earthly life, you have to read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also John. And John is sometimes a little bit at variance with the Matthew, Mark, and Luke stories. And so some commentators try to harmonize the two accounts. The synoptic accounts of Matthew and Luke are based on Mark, and John it has got other information. And then after that, Jesus is crucified. While he is crucified, he is derided on the cross by the bystanders. Verse 29, those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel," they're mocking him, "come down from the cross so that we may see and believe." And those who were crucified with him also taunted him. And of course, in the other synoptic gospels, you have one thief on the cross taunting him, and the other saying to Jesus, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And we'd like to know exactly what that means. But then eventually, verse 33, you have the death of Jesus. Jesus cries out with a loud voice, the opening verse of Psalm 22, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The bystanders don't get it. And they say, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And then they fill a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." So they're mocking him even as he is just really dying. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. Verse 38, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And then when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this was a son of God." And then there were women looking on. All of the male disciples had fled. And it's the women who looked on and were with Jesus at his death. And then eventually there was the burial of Jesus. The witnesses of the crucifixion are important because the women at the empty tomb were also witnesses that the tomb was empty. And so they witnessed his death, and they also witnessed that when he was buried and the stone sealed the entrance to the tomb, and then the stone was rolled away and he was not there, they also witnessed that what the angel said to them, "He is not here, he is risen." So the women who were at the death of Jesus, they were people who witnessed his death, and they saw to it that he had actually died. And he was not merely resuscitated, he actually died. And they saw his burial. They went to anoint his dead body on the first day of the week after the Passover was over. and they saw that he was not there. But the witnesses of the crucifixion were the women. And notably in Mark, well, in the fourth gospel, the faithful followers of Jesus who witnessed his crucifixion and death included the beloved disciple, who, by the way, is never mentioned by name in the Gospel of John. He's the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then in John, he says to the beloved disciple, "Behold your mother." And then he says to Mary, and Mary is never mentioned by name either. He says to his mother, "Behold your son." And then the beloved disciple takes Jesus' mother into his home from that very hour. But that's only in the Gospel of John. But the others have fled. And then after that, they have the burial of Jesus. And so the women who were the disciples of Jesus not only witnessed his death, but also witnessed his burial. And they were the ones in Mark that told the other disciples, "He is risen." The men fled. It was the women who were the first witnesses of the resurrection, because they were the ones that saw that the tomb was empty, and they were the ones that the angel spoke to, and the angel told them, "He is not here, he is risen." So they were witnesses not only of Jesus' death, also his burial, and they were witnesses of the resurrection. And so the readers of Mark, or any of the other Gospels, are reading information that comes originally from oral tradition, from people who witnessed his death and his resurrection. I've said quite a lot. Is there anything you'd like to say or like to ask? Please. And you have to shout.
You said that you said that the disciple that Jesus loved, I guess I've always heard that it was John. And so I'm just asking you, if it's not where is it in the Bible that points out that the beloved disciple is John?
Nowhere. He's simply called the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple. It is nowhere in the New Testament that he was John. Nowhere. It's in subsequent Christian tradition, because they also tried to give names to other people who are not named. So it's in subsequent Christian tradition, nowhere in the New Testament.
It also strikes me as odd that he would say to this disciple, "Take care of my mom," when she had all these other children. Why didn't they take care of her?
Well, she has all these other children in the Synoptic Gospels, and we don't hear about these other children in the fourth Gospel. So what we're really looking at is we're looking at multiple traditions of what the family of Jesus was like. In Mark, Jesus basically rejects his earthly family, because they've come to get him because they think he's crazy. They've heard that he's beside himself because he's healing people. That must mean that he had a stronger daimon than the people who had little daimons, because the stronger daimon can overpower the little daimon. So they hear that Jesus is crazy in the head, and so they come and get him. And he refuses to be taken home by Mary and the other brothers and sisters. And then also in Mark, you have when Jesus preaches in the synagogue in Galilee, in Nazareth, they say, "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't his mother Mary here? And aren't his brother James and Joses and others, and Judah, aren't they here with us? And aren't their sisters still with us?" So in the Synoptic Gospels, basically in Mark, you have the tradition of the family of Jesus. And in the fourth Gospel, which clearly has other sources that are independent of the Synoptics, you have the beloved disciple, unnamed, and the mother of Jesus is never given a name in the Gospel of John either. Remember at the Cana, at the wedding feast in chapter 2, woman.
What does synoptic mean versus like John is not a synoptic?
No, the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
But
Optimi means to view or to see, and sun means together with. And sun in Greek becomes kan or cum in Latin. And so the synoptic gospels are Matthew and Mark and Luke because they are so close to each other.
Okay,
And they're so close to each other because Matthew and Luke use Mark.
right.
And John has got so much that's so different. See, in the synoptic gospels, Jesus goes to Jerusalem once as an adult. And in John, unless you rearrange the Gospel of John, Jesus goes to Jerusalem 3 times as an adult. You can't reconcile that. So basically, John has different sources than Mark and Matthew and Luke. So the synoptic gospels is just a shorthand way of saying Matthew, Mark, and Luke together when they agree.
Could you clarify the women who were there? I keep reading this and going back and forth over to John and then maybe to somewhere else. And, I don't see where it says his mother was there.
It says it.
The demon-ridden one, and then...
Not here, but when the family of Jesus come and get Jesus because they think he's crazy, they think he's sick, and they want to take him home.
Okay.
But there he is mentioned. There the brothers are mentioned.
Okay. Well, what about Solomon? Is that...
What now?
Is that the one that danced and cut off James's head or whatever? Or John's head? It says Mary Magdalene.
Salome was one of the daughters of Herod Antipas who danced. And then the wife of Herod Antipas, who had been the wife of his brother, said, what does the little girl want? And he says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a plate. See, so that's the flashback that includes the death of John the Baptist.
Is that the same one?
No,
Okay.
that's Salome, and that's the daughter of Herodias, who was the wife of Herod Antipas, who was the Jewish puppet ruler of Judea.
Okay.
But early in Jesus' healing ministry, the family of Jesus go try to get Jesus because they have heard that he's doing this healing, and the way you do the healing is because you have a more powerful spirit or daimon that can heal the people with the minor daimons. And so that means, in popular parlance, that would mean that Jesus has a daimon.
Okay. But the 3 women there do not include his mother.
At the empty tomb, that's right. It's Jesus' mother is with the beloved disciple witnessing the crucifixion of Jesus in John. That's in the Gospel of John.
Okay.
But she is not given her name in the Gospel of John. She is the mother of Jesus.
Okay. But she wasn't in Mark here. The 3 of them watching.
When the family wants to come and get Jesus because they think he's crazy or mentally ill or however you want to call it, she is there with the brothers and his sisters. And then when Jesus preaches in Nazareth, well, look, if you look at Mark 6:3, Mark chapter 6, verse 2, on that Sabbath, he's in Nazareth, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded, and they said, where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that's been given to him? What deeds of power are being done at his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joses, and Judas, and Shimon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. So basically, the family of Jesus is well known, and by the time Jesus is an adult, we don't hear anything more about Joseph, his earthly father. Okay, we have 5 more minutes for questions. How did that happen? This is what happens when you go through the Gospel of Mark like lightning.
And why did he think he was surprised that he was dead so quickly? Because it takes longer than whatever?
Jesus was flogged, and when he was flogged, they used what's been called a cat o' nine tails, and it includes pieces of metal and pieces of bone. And so the flogging would break the skin and give you massive bruising, and you'd be bleeding. And so when you bleed like that, all over your back, and then the whole point is when you're crucified, you're crucified between the radius and ulna, and you're constantly having to push up or pull up to breathe. But if you try to lean your back against the cross, then your back is worse than raw. See, so it's the worst kind of execution the Romans could think of. They were very good at it. And so it became the tradition that a Roman citizen could not be crucified, which is the tradition that Paul was beheaded as opposed to Peter, who was crucified.
But then it said that the crucifixion was also Jewish law. Somewhere in here I read that.
No, the crucifixion is something that the Romans thought of. But there is a Jewish scripture in Deuteronomy about cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. There is an Old Testament quote, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, yes. But the crucifixion was Roman law, and the death of Jesus was Roman law. Pontius Pilate could only enforce Roman law. Pontius Pilate could not enforce the Torah.
Okay, it says, execute Jesus in Roman fashion, crucifixion based on Jewish verdict. That's what I got mixed up, sorry.
Which is the idea that the Jews could have a verdict in the Sanhedrin, and they could have the verdict, but all they could do would be to bring charges against Jesus, and then the case would be decided on the basis of Roman law by Pontius Pilate. And so in Gnilka's book, Jesus of Nazareth, which I really recommend to you, we should get a copy of it for the library. But he gives a full rundown of Roman law, according to which Jesus could have been taken to death. One of them was per duellio, which is serious hostility against the country, and crimen majestatis populi Romani immunente, harm inflicted upon the reputation of the Roman people. And then the crimen majestatis, the crime against the majesty of the Roman people, has wider implications. And so people were put to death according to that part of Roman law. So there's ample reason under Roman law that they would have wanted to put Jesus to death because of his crime against the reputation of the Roman people and the crime really of insurrection. Because the Romans didn't like insurrection. Because if they had a big insurrection, that means the army had to come and they had to have a big bloody war. And wars are very expensive. So they put in people like Pontius Pilate and others to keep the lid on things.